Dr. Carl Asplund. So whenever we start a seminar, he always has a great idea for an introductory lecture that will get students kind of around the whole idea of what the seminar is about. So he immediately thought about Marshall McLuhan and some work that he had done before. So you will be hearing from him today. The talk is titled "In a Global Village Without a Map." And you should take notes, but pay attention also. So without further ado, Dr. Asplund.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Glad to see such a large crowd here, and hopefully Dr. Welch's rather generous introduction will not overhype your expectations about this. But yes, exactly. The first thing that came to mind on hearing about the topic of the seminar this year was indeed Marshall McLuhan. And McLuhan came to mind because of the rather astonishing foresight he had about the effect of modern media, and most notably electronic media, on our culture. And a rather interesting thing is that he wasn't really about that at all himself in terms of his work or his research, at least not to begin with. He was a professor of literature and was coming into this sort of obliquely, trying to understand what was going on with modern English literature and trying to figure out what happened to create things like James Joyce or E.E. Cummings or any of these sort of strange linguistic games that were going on with Samuel Beckett, that kind of thing, if any of that rings any bells. But basically, what he began to see was that the new media, which in his time was radio and television, you have to notice that, and that's very important for today's discussion, that McLuhan actually dies before the advent of the internet, or at least the internet as we know it. He dies in 1980. And rather oddly, or perhaps not, with the benefit of hindsight, he kind of fell out of favor in scholarly circles right after his death because of the kind of plateauing that happened there. Now, we're talking about a time before most of the students in here were born, when in the 80s it would seem that media was kind of not developing as rapidly as people expected. Technology was not developing as rapidly. Yes, there was cable TV, but the sort of brave new world of modern technology wasn't really arriving. So people looked at McLuhan and thought, oh, well, okay, he didn't quite get it. And then the internet exploded on us in the 90s, right about the time most of you were born. Right? Birth date?
July 3rd, 91.
91, okay. Birth date? Kara? 92, right. 92? 92. Early 90s. The internet, suddenly, bang, there it is. And suddenly McLuhan comes to the fore. Suddenly they notice that he had seen something that perhaps others had not. Now, there's an awful lot of McLuhan out there, and there's an awful lot of discussion about McLuhan out there. And forewarned now, excuse my language, there's an incredible amount of bullshit on McLuhan out there. And I'm using that word very guardedly and very carefully, and to our friends on the camera over there, deal with it. Because there's really no other way of putting it. So be very careful about that when you run into McLuhan or talk about McLuhan. I'm hoping to actually address some of the major BS points today. But the basic three, right, the basic three that matter for this seminar are also, and this is why I'm starting off with this rather unguarded language, the basic three are also the ones that are usually the most misunderstood. These are McLuhan's big three, these are McLuhan's big cliches, if you will. Bandied about, thrown around, generally not understood too well by people who are talking about them. So on one hand we talk about modern media and modern electronic technology as extensions of self. we talk about the global village. This is probably the most misunderstood of McLuhan's terms, where he talks about the effect of technology on society. And then the famous phrase, the medium is the message, which, like Andy Warhol's 15 minutes of fame for everybody in modern society, is also largely misunderstood and used rather wrongly. However, if we look at it very carefully, we can understand an awful lot of what's happened. And we understand that actually, when we look at the internet, and if we're going to talk about fashion and the internet, it's really not the internet so much as the fact that the internet is just one more chapter in a story. That we're looking at the internet, but we're actually talking about communications technology. And it goes as far back as telegraph, radio, film, television. The internet's just one more, right? So it's not really the internet. It's what the internet represents as a culmination, or maybe not even a culmination, as a next step in a process. So before we go any further, I'm just going to give you a very quick history lesson. I mean very quick. Where we actually see that McLuhan was part of a trend himself. That despite the fact that he is considered a prophet of the internet age, he wasn't really. Despite the fact that he is considered the person to have sort of seen this first, he didn't really. This was all over the place in the sociological, philosophical, historical discussion of the post-World War II decades. So the 1950s, 1960s, and even the 30s were beginning to produce this kind of thinking of what is this new technology going to bring us? What on earth is going on here? And people were looking at this. Now, the thing that makes McLuhan such magic in this discussion is that he pointed out literally the effects of these things in terms of the dialogue they have with us as people. But I'll get to that in a second. I just want to mention a couple of things. Now, I know you have to summarize this, so I'm pulling out sort of the crucial bits, okay? But if anyone wants to go completely wacko on us and you need the full citation, just send me an email and I'll send it to you. But I'm just keeping it simple. Just want to point out to you first Walter Benjamin, who wrote about the age of mechanical reproduction back in 1936. And he was wondering about what happens to art, what happens to authenticity, what happens to the real art when you have reprints, when you have film, when you have multiple versions of things all over the place. And in talking about film, he points out that we have this rather interesting shift in how we perceive the world once we can perceive it on film, whether it's in photographs or whether it's in moving pictures. Now, he was specifically talking about moving pictures, but photographs will do just as well. We can suddenly see spaces that we do not consciously see in our living moments. Think about a freeze frame. Think about slow motion. Think about the art of the close-up in film. This is not how we perceive the world. But yet, when I mention it to you now, in your head you have this sort of visual language where you recognize how the world is seen. And filmmakers, of course, do this very deliberately. They show you the close-up, they change the camera angle, they go to a high shot, a low shot, a mid shot, a two shot, whatever it is, and they tell their story very much by the angle of the camera. This is not how we perceive the world. And yet, now it is. For us who now have the visual language of film almost built in from the time we are children. So, an unconsciously penetrated space, the close-up of someone's face, for example, is now substituted for what we actually see. And we remember this as how we view things And I remember a very odd moment after the towers fell on 9/11. I was in a Radio Shack of all things, and of course constant repeats, constant replays of the incident, and the memorial service was on. And I hear two teenagers are looking at the screens, and one of them says to the other, "Did you see the scene where the guy jumped out of the window?" Did you see the scene? He was perceiving reality as a film, as a movie, right? Okay. Heidegger, German philosopher, points out in 1950 that all distances in time and space are literally shrinking in modern society. This is not news. This is not news. This is just a way of phrasing it. What makes it news in the way Heidegger talked about it, or wrote about it, was that it brings into question what is near. What is near to you in terms of your experience? What is close to you in terms of your environment? Let's see, there are some computers on the desk here. Are you online? Are you online? It's not a trick question. I'm not trying to trap you. It's okay. Okay. But you could Google Shanghai Fashion Week for me, right? Okay. Now, if he has Shanghai Fashion Week on his screen, which is closer to us, the Providence Biltmore or Shanghai? Right? You see my point? That's Heidegger's point. Everybody knew, yes, we can fly places, we can take trains, we can get to things, and we listen to the radio, and that's all very good. But what it brings into question is the concept of nearness. Okay, hold that thought. And by the way, as we get further down, we're getting closer and closer to McLuhan, in case anybody forgot we're talking about McLuhan. Now we have de Chardin, who was a direct influence on McLuhan. McLuhan studied this guy very carefully, who was of all things a Jesuit archaeologist, which actually is relevant, but that would take me another lecture to describe. But what de Chardin points out, among other things, is the compression that affects the complexity of society and raises the psychic temperature. The psychic temperature, what does that mean? What does that mean? Think about blogs. Think about responses to blogs. Think about online discourse. Think about the kind of exchanges, the heat of the exchange, how quickly discussions online, for example, explode into name-calling and craziness, right? Does anybody know the name of the law that invokes that as soon as somebody mentions Hitler in an online discussion, that person has immediately lost the argument or something like that? Anyway, it doesn't matter. But what he's talking about there is the way that electronic media increases the pressure on culture, that it increases the rate of exchange. It's literally like talking about physics. The more pressure you put on something, the more temperature you get inside. Okay? Harold Innes, contemporary and mentor to McLuhan. Now we'll slow down just a second. From McInnes, McLuhan takes the concepts of media bias. And now we're not talking about bias in terms of opinions held, but the bias in terms of how they actually operate, how they work, what effect they have on society. And the two basic phases there are time and space, where one type of media affects information and culture and society in time. The other affects it in space. On one hand, you have sort of heavy, durable media, clay tablets, stone tablets, heavy parchment manuscripts, things that don't move much, the things that are around for a very long time. These bind the information, these bind the culture into time. They endure. We can go to the pyramids and we can see the hieroglyphs, right? They're there. We We can go to the Mayan ruins and we can see inscriptions, right? They're bound in time. This tends to belong to oral cultures, where knowledge is not necessarily kept in these inscriptions. Knowledge is generally based on speech and oral discourse. Strangely enough, you'd think that would be a little counterintuitive. But the point is, it has to be oral because the storage of information takes too long, right? If you're going to send somebody a letter and it takes you 3 weeks to carve it into a granite slab somewhere, you might as well just grab your nearest donkey and head over and tell them, right? Huge simplification, but you get my drift. Now the other side is the space-binding media, and this is the media that is impermanent, moves quickly, transportable, but tends to disappear pretty fast. And this is the story of the past 200 years in terms of media development. We've been moving toward faster and faster and less durable communications. To the point now where we have communications that simply aren't there, right? We even have emailing systems now and messaging systems that self-destruct, right? In order that they not be downloaded to the NSA somewhere, okay? Or to whoever you don't want looking at them, which is by now, of course, everybody. But there are two things in terms of social emphasis and culture that matter here. On one hand, you have centralization of information, where you have a culture that is contracting, is stable, is steady, tends toward religious and hierarchical structures, with the very, very developed and strong messages carved in stone. On the other hand, you have widespread, fast, moving outward, and emphasizing the future and the technical. If you can think about it this way, and you might, although I'm not going to go into it now, you can think of it as one hand as the media of the colonized versus the media of the colonizers, right?